It may be all right.
Okay, for those of you in the back, I just want to make sure you're with us, all right? Because this is all the stuff you'll need for the quiz on Thursday. All right. Okay, y'all still wrapping up? Okay. So the notes are going to be up here, and if you have them at home, you can play along to make sure this is not. Okay. All right. All right, so most of our quiz will be exactly like this, group quizzes. Okay, so make sure you're here on time and so your group mates are able to participate in your genius, right? We're all the more brilliant together. So today's lecture is covering chapter 1 and chapter 10. Why do you think I'm starting with chapter 10? For those that had a chance to crack their book. What got me to chapter 10? Religion and spirituality. What makes this university unique?
Is it religious campus?
It's a religious campus, yeah. What's our mission?
Enter to serve.
That's our motto. That's our motto. Now, our mission is to transform lives through biblically based education so that we can serve the world, right? And within our motto, it's captured within both of those things, right? Learning and serving. Okay. When I was here, we didn't have it wasn't written anywhere. People just say it all the time. Enter to learn, depart to serve, right? And that's a big part of who we are. So in order to understand that, you're understanding something that many people talk about and experience, but don't necessarily put to a scholarly frame. And I want you to be able to do that after today. All right. So one of my favorite quotes from Asa Hilliard, Dr. Asa Hilliard, he passed away in 2007, but his conversation often was to be African or not to be. If you think about all the efforts to erase African history, literally get rid of African people, all the bodies that are underneath the Atlantic Ocean after the transatlantic slave trade, or who didn't even make it to the ocean, but who had to make walks from different parts of Africa to places like the dungeons in Cape Coast, or the Elmina dungeon, which is nearby, both the English and the Portuguese respectively, right? If you think about all of that, yet we are still here, right? And when we make a choice to be African, we're defying even that idea that you should be erased, right? That's a pretty powerful choice. You've seen recently, I don't know if you've seen on social media, but these young people with dreadlocks trying to go to preschool or elementary school, or trying to graduate from high school and being told that their hair is not welcome. The natural way their body grows is not welcome. That's a residual of this same mentality, right? To be African or not to be, right? If I choose to be African, whoa, that's a beautiful thing. Especially when someone tried to literally take it from me or take me. Okay, so I figured we'd begin there. I had a chance to go to the Association of Black Psychologists. That's what ABPSI stands for, the Association of Black Psychologists convention last summer. And I met one of the authors of our books, Dr. Faye Belgrave. Right? And I talked with her a little bit about the book and why we use it here. There's many books on African or Black psychology and African-centered psychology. She offers, and I think our department here at Oakwood offers one of the most scientifically based Black psychology courses, but also programs, right? And our students, if you make it through and graduate from here, you're more than prepared for graduate school. You're prepared to do quite well, but to also answer these challenges that Black people face. A lot of people will write memes about what's wrong with Black folk or this or that, or about the issues that we're facing, but to go out and do something about it, you have to be grounded in some strong technical theory as well as love for Black people. I don't know if y'all get it. I've seen musical artists in person. Coming to Oakwood, most musical artists are really poor. I'm just using my Oakwood bias. I'm an Oakwood alum. That's just the way I see it, and I really don't care. But if I see an author of one of my textbooks, I lose my cookies. I was excited. I wouldn't let her go. I started taking pictures. I don't usually do selfies and that kind of thing, but I was like, please, someone take a picture of me with Dr. Belgrave. Why? Because I have to share it with my students. And I want y'all to feel like you're that connected, right? These are the kind of folks I hang out with, and I teach here, right? I was a student here, right? So yeah, that can be you too, writing one of these books. It's not hard. All right, so some vocabulary from chapter 1, right? And some of that vocabulary, African-American. Right. If you've had a chance to look at the book, or if you've not, what's your best guess? It's all right to guess because we're not taking a quiz right now. What's your best guess on the term African American? What does that mean to you?
It means somebody brought from Africa to America, and now they claim the nationality.
Okay, there's a lot unpacked in there. Somebody brought to. And they claim the nationality. At CSS, we had an interesting conversation this morning about enslaved Africans, right? And particularly descendants of American slavery versus those who are African American but who are not descendants of at least American chattel slavery, right? And how there were only 2 of us in the office who are from that descendant of American slavery. Only 2 of us in the office. Everyone else is either from the Caribbean or from Africa. And I said, for me, coming to Oakwood, it was interesting in that most of my teachers were not from America directly. I'm thinking I'm going to a historically Black college that's supposed to be a traditionally American experience, but yet it's American, but then it's not the American I grew up. I'm talking collard greens, mac and cheese. I'm gonna give you something specific to Texas. Hot water cornbread. If you have leftover grits, you have them that evening and you put them in syrup, right? There were a lot of folks who never even heard of this, right? So my particular, right. My particular American experience, but there are many people who have heard of beans and rice, Callaloo, right?
It's rice and
Thank you. See, I knew I'd get a correction, right? Rice and peas, right? Many different folks, but like just within this room, you can feel the difference, right? So if I say African American, it may not cover everything we need to cover. I'll give you this other piece. I do studies. I've done 3 studies with Black parents. Every time I do the study, I start off asking for Black or African American. And it takes me a while to be able to get to Nigerian, Ethiopian, particularly African folks from the continent, because I have to give a specific call to them, because sometimes they don't see, like, I'm not sure our experience will meet with yours, right? Or they don't see it as relevant to them. But once I do, they answer the survey, right? And the kind of things I research are Black parents and their experiences raising college-educated children. So I look at, like, if they've gotten their child to the 2nd year, I'm interested in what they did for them as parents to be able to get to that point. Right. So, Black. But one of the guys who works in our office, he was like, yeah, I'm Black. I'm not African American. I don't know where that came from. There was a conversation in the 80s, somebody brought that up, but okay, whatever. I'm Black. Right. And some people use that very politically as well. Like, I'm not going to lock down to whatever your country is. I'm even Black, like those people in Australia are Black. They're so old, they don't even know what time they got to the earth or whatever, I'm with them too, right? Or the original Filipinos, right? Who are dark as anyone here, right? And it's kinky hair, it's whole nine, right? I'm that. So some people make those connections. Negro, right? Always interested me how they got to that point where they were using Negro. I have several aunts who have Spanish sounding names. They were born in like the 40s and 50s, but I think my grandmother really liked using Spanish words, although she spoke not a lick of Spanish. Her name was Juanita, by the way, my grandmother. Right. So, and never been to Mexico or South America, but they were into that. But this idea of using the term Negro, I think it's kind of black folks' way of saying you're not going to define me one way, right? But it was a way to be discussed in literature, right? So you hear Martin Luther King and several other people using the term, right, Negro. There was a few people who were like, man, we probably need to go back to being Negro because we own more businesses and more houses and more of us were graduating from school when we were Negro than we were black. Just interesting kind of piece, but there's a peak to that, right? And we'll talk about it a bit more, but there was a peak to kind of the use of that term and then also kind of the Negro culture, right? You know, there's a range of Negro culture or black culture or African-American culture. One I didn't put in there because they didn't put in the book is AfroAmerican, right? And I don't know if y'all experienced this when I was a little kid. If somebody had an afro, it would make people giggle, right? And my mom was always putting my hair in an afro, and I didn't want to go to school with an afro because everybody would be giggling the whole time, and I didn't know if they were giggling at me or whatever it was. I didn't want the extra attention. But that term Afro-American they used it a little bit in between the 60s and 70s, and then somebody had a meeting and African-American came out. All right. Psychology. What is psychology? Study of the mind and its functions. Okay, that is a very Western concept. Study of the mind and its function. Okay, how can you think about your mind when you have a mind? You have a mind, you have a brain?
Yeah, you have a mind.
A brain and a head? What else do you have that's up in there? Right. There's something that Africans have and where the Greeks got it from. Because the Greeks started talking about a mind, but the Africans had a broader connection. If we even read Ellen White's book, Education, where she's talking about Moses' education, right? The soul, right? The study of the soul, really, and how to enliven and illuminate the soul could be another definition of psychology.
I like that.
That's coming from the Association of Black Psychologists. And they're getting that from some parts of Egyptian psychology, but definitely many parts of African psychology. Rather than looking for what's wrong or what may be wrong with the mind, right? I'm looking to, I know the mind's good. It's provided that we can connect it to the right things and put it in the right environment, it will expand and do amazing things. There's no limit to what the mind can do, or what the brain and the soul and the spirit all together can do. I'll just even give you an example from the Bible. Holy Spirit comes. What are they able to do when the Holy Spirit comes rushing in?
Languages.
Yeah. Like all parts of the brain had to have been lit up, right? That's psychology to me. Right? To me, Jesus is like the ultimate psychologist, right? Right. He sees people by the pool of Bethesda and like, so you just gonna sit there, right? You know you can get up, right? Really? That's like a miracle in passing. Like that was like a no-look pass for Jesus. And dude gets up and walks. That was all there. Right? But the access to it, enliven and illuminate that spirit, that's a powerful thing. All right. Let me shift gears. Some of these other vocabulary words, because we got a lot I want to go through here. So drapetomania. Anybody ever heard of this?
Mania.
Okay, drapetomania. So in American psychology, and I'll talk a little bit about the person who wrote a bit about American psychology, but in American psychology, right, there was this whole idea that Negroes, or niggers as they would say, and I'm using the vocabulary of the 1800s, there was something wrong with them if they wanted to run away. And that term would be drapetomania. Harriet Tubman had drapetomania. Why would she not want to stay on this nice plantation where we're taking care of? Why would Dred Scott not want to stay here with the Prescott family before this turns into Oakwood? He would have benefited from staying here. He's got that drapetomania. And the first psychologists were looking at that. There's a book called Black Ivy about the development of Ivy League schools. Most of their scholarship was young white men from the Caribbean who traveled in between Oxford, Harvard, Brown, and Yale, right? And they would write about their black slaves, particularly if they were on an island. They're like a captured population, and they could write about them and make up whatever they wanted to about them. But drapetomania was a common conversation amongst these so-called scholars.
So cool.
Yeah, and that's what they built their scholarship on. Yeah. Interesting term. Eugenics. Anyone heard of this? Okay. Darwin's cousin. Now, he's really trying to do some science, and I've seen some displays on Darwin, and Darwin actually believed in God, but folks now his cousin was like, man, that Darwin, he's making some money. Let me come up with an idea. Let me look at craniums and brains and classify people based upon things that make absolutely no sense related to who they are. But we'll look at their brain, right, and say, okay, because the Negro brain weighs 0.2 ounces difference from this one to that one, we'll make all these extrapolations about who they are and what they can and can't do, right? That was Galton, eugenics, right? And the eugenics movement comes around the same time we start with public schools in England and the United States, and people are saying if we offer these public schools to people, then we're going to be mixing these people with lower genetic potential, and that's going to mess with our race. You even see traces of it this week in the news. There is a Nobel Prize winning scientist that says, too bad the blacks have low IQs. That came out this week in the regular news. I ain't talking about the alternative fact news. I'm talking about regular news. This came out this week. Another thing that came out this week is low birth rates, particularly in European countries and the United States, right? That's the whole conversation around eugenics. I just want you to be aware of those things. This is kind of the lay of land that when we discuss black psychology, African-American psychology, these are the main issues going on, right? Because if people actually believe that black folk are inferior, they'll go ahead and make a whole policy on your inferiority. Well, if we know that these people are inferior, then we're going to build more prisons. Or we'll build more mental institutions, or we get ready to put more of them in special education, and we'll get better at doing it. And in the process, we can make some money. Ever heard of the prison industrial complex? All right. There's also big pharma and pharmaceutical corporations that allow people, if you got lower IQ, you might have the ADHD, and if you got the ADHD, then we got to give you the meds. See how that works?
Yeah.
Right. And it's a race. I don't know where we're racing to, but it's a race. Right? Therefore, this whole concept of race. Somebody wins, somebody loses in a race. Right. Okay. Chapter 10. Spiritus is a Latin word. Spirituality has been defined as the belief in a sacred force that exists in all things. Right? And that's a part of an African belief system, particularly in African psychology. Psych comes from an African word called saku, saku meaning soul, the study of the soul. Right? Okay. Religio. Okay. There's another Latin word, system of beliefs and practices that nurture the relationship with the supreme being. Yoruba or Ifa or Orishas, right? different religious practices. The Orishas in your book will talk about these different things. These are certain vocabulary words. Most Africans in the Caribbean, South America, and America practice some or a form of these types of religions. Okay. There's even a group of Brazilians who left Brazil and went back to Ghana and established a colony. They were Yoruba. Okay. One of the religions that's recognized in Brazil is Yoruba. Okay. Voodoo or Santeria, I'm not going to scare anybody, but I just want you to know that it's out there. I met a voodoo practitioner. He said, interesting thing about voodoo. Voodoo was around before Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, any of those. And the basic thing with voodoo is creation, earth, water, sky. Now, where people go with that, that's a whole nother deal, right? But it's the essential elements, right? And I imagine like Abraham. Abraham didn't have a book. It's God and Abraham and a few, like Melchizedek, just rolling up on it. Right? Or he has to go by Egypt and deal with their whole structure, but he's like, whoa, man, I hear you, but like me and God, we're talking right now. They're like, yeah, right. And then they eventually had to deal with him because he was dealing with some heavy forces. He's like, hey, man, I don't know what's going on with you, but you got to bounce. You took out the whole kingdom of Egypt while you just stopped by. You're not a good guest. Right. So, and these are all very kind of African themes that you can even see within the Bible. The Akan, right? And particularly, and it didn't mention it, but for Africans in America, the Ashanti, and particularly Adventists, Ashanti keep the Sabbath, if y'all didn't know, in rabbinical laws. Like, they don't eat pork. Right?
Oh, that.
Yeah, yeah. I read about it before, but I've seen it firsthand being in Ghana. Right? Other vocabulary word is coping. How do I deal with all of this, right, from day to day? And how do I use my African understanding of the world, spirituality, religion, my understanding of my relationship with God to cope with things that happen in my life? Right? Okay. Right. Any questions on these vocabulary words? Yeah.
Would you say did you give a definition for a con?
The Khan are a group of people, right? That similar to the Yoruba, they have some similar beliefs. I'm glad you asked. And they had some similar beliefs. The book didn't get as into kind of what we know. That's why I went more with some of the Ashanti, right? But the book definitely does talk about the Akan and their broad kingdom. You can read on and on about their kingdom and their belief systems and their structure, right? Some people say, what have African people contributed to civilization? We keep contributing again and again. We've contributed so much that it's just within the foundation and fabric of who we are as humans on the world, right? And the Akan were a part of that group. So well before, Portuguese come traveling down through the middle of Africa, the Akan were kind of holding it down with kingdoms and structures within that system and ways of viewing the world. I can get into, who else? I'm trying to think of the folks in the Congo, right? And certain concepts like Ubuntu. And Ubuntu is just simply the essence of being human, and that a large part of it is that I see you as another human being, right? And one of their major concepts is that we're all, and you may catch this, right, within Christianity, we're all sons, right? We rise and we set, right? We have a beginning and an end to life. And just within that, they're able to kind of break down some other concepts of who we are and what our life span is about. As you get to the middle of the day, you should be productive. You should be doing things with your life. As you get to your 40s, if you're going to live to your 80s, you should be doing deeper things, right? And as you leave, but they also have a thing about reincarnation, you come back, right? Okay, and you may come back in some other form. I'm basic with my kids will pass on whatever I gave to them, right? Okay, and as I mentioned last week, I'm one generation away from slavery, right? But I'm also one generation away of surviving that too. So I have all of that too, of surviving that. Y'all follow that? Okay. All right. We recently lost, 2 weeks ago, from Florida A&M, Dr. Kobe Kambon. He started writing in the 80s and 90s as Joseph Baldwin. After the 90s, he was known as Kobe Kambon. But he defines black psychology was formed as a reaction to Western psychology. It's a consequence of, let me move this slide forward here. There we go. Consequence of being black in America, right? Now, when you react to something, it isn't always as strong. You can be a counterpuncher. Anybody ever watch a fight with Muhammad Ali, especially his against George Foreman in the rope-a-dope? He gets beat up for 10 rounds, and he just stays on the ropes and blocks. George Foreman is so big, he gets tired. George Foreman, who, rather than put a fist up at the 1968 Olympics and stand in solidarity with the rest of the black athletes, George Foreman stood with the United States and said, "Oh, the United States is perfect." 1968, same year Martin Luther King's killed. Okay. Ali versus Foreman. Foreman tires himself out, and eventually Ali just says, "All right, that's all you got?" He's huffing and puffing. 2 shots knocks him down. It's a reaction. It's a powerful one, but Ali paid a price, right, for constantly reacting. Okay. Our ancestors got stories, y'all. Okay, right. But this idea of reaction to something, in HBCU, for good or bad, is a reaction. A historically black college. We're different than, and I've been to the University of Ghana. Okay. I go to the University of Ghana. How old are they? Thousands of years old. How old is Oakwood? 122. We're adolescent compared to the University of Ghana. You follow that? Okay. And they're not a reaction. Right? We're a reaction who's trying to become proactive. Right? And we've only spent the last 50 years trying to be proactive, because prior to that, we're having to react to an environment that says it's illegal for you to even be. It's illegal for you to drink. It's illegal for you to stop by the side of the road and use the restroom at Waffle House, of all places. Anybody been? Anyway. You follow me? Yeah. Yeah.
That's my spot.
Yeah, man, yeah. They got some good grits. I like that. All right.
It's better than IHOP, so.
Yep.
Way better than
All right, we can have this as existential conversation later. IHOP versus Waffle House. That's deep stuff. That's deep stuff. Okay.
I mean, I said,
All right. So African psychology existed without Europeans, right? And this is Kambon's major argument. There's African ways of being and knowing to enliven and illuminate the soul, and even study the phenomena of black life without Europeans. But most of the time, it had been a reaction. Okay. Nonetheless, black psychology is also African psychology, because we are who we are. Great things get passed forward. I believe this week, Kamala Harris is going to declare her presidency for the United States of America. Kamala Harris, she is a senator
Say what?
from California. She's not Hispanic. She is Indian and African American. She's a member of Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority, right? Yeah, and it's their birthday today too, AKs, or their anniversary or Founders Day today as well, right? But just think about that story. It was Rosa Parks, another one of her AKA sisters, had to do what she did almost 60 years ago, just so people can sit where they wanted to sit and be where they wanted to be. And yet, less than 60 years later, you have somebody getting ready to have a legitimate run at the presidency of the United States of America.
So you believe she's gonna?
Yeah, I've seen news articles
Okay.
that she's supposed to do it today on MLK's birthday. So, but I haven't seen the one where like it's official. But yeah. But she could potentially win. Okay. Interesting times we live in. Okay. So a lot of black psychology that's been written about over the last 60 years has gotten much of their conversation from Kemet or Egypt, okay, and West Africa. Okay. Most of it started off with Kemet or Egypt because had been the most researched, because people were interested in the bottom line. They were interested in gold and fame, right? And they researched the language and other things. Right? But West Africa is becoming more and more known, and it's deeper. I'll just give you even like the Ndinkra symbols. Anybody seen the Guiname symbol? Okay, and it means without God, I wouldn't have made it, or but God is kind of the loose translation. Right? Okay, if you drive in Ghana, almost every car, whether they're Christian, Muslim, Buddhist, they have whatever religion they believe in, but they still understand that concept. That without God, I can't make this. And most people have it on their businesses because they like, God's helping me with whatever business I have. Right? And they believe in small businesses in Ghana for sure. There's folks selling it. Like, you'll go into the business, somebody's selling something on top of selling something. Oh, you don't like that? Okay, just hold on. Let me get my cousin. I'll sell you something. Like, folks work and hustle there. But the idea is they believe in God, right? Okay. Let me get to the next one. I mentioned a bit of Even the Rat Was White. Dr. Robert Guthrie wrote that book, and this is kind of a thing we do at the Association of Black Psychologists, that pictures from, we remember these folks who contributed greatly to the Association of Black Psychologists, but he looked really at American psychology, and I had a chance to meet him a few times at some of the conventions. I'd sit next to him, and he'd go to people's talks and give them a hard time. But his push was, we need to be able to tell our story and contribute to science, right? It's one thing for us to have internal conversations, but he still wanted us to be able to, like, if they miss our story, and he's talking about the rest of the world misses the Black story of overcoming all that we've overcome, they're missing a large contribution to psychology and science, right? So one of the other things he wrote about is that, you know, they used to have Africans in zoos, right? That's what makes zoos very problematic, because they put together a lion and a tiger and pygmies. Right? And he chronicles the story of these two pygmies who they would parade them around and they put them in their garden and they leave in suits, but they've both kind of lost their mind. Like it was real straight evil, but at the same time, just basic psychology, they couldn't keep their mind together in that type of environment. People coming up and wanted to touch their hair and wanted to ooh and ah about them, right? Okay, going back to some of the eugenics pieces we were talking about, but people believed in that kind of thing. And he cataloged this. But my favorite contribution was his cataloging the first of Black graduate students coming out of HBCUs, going to places like Howard and Hampton, Florida A&M, and he's a Florida A&M grad. There's two, and I'm just bothered that I'm featuring these Florida A&M grads, but nonetheless, they're sharp folks. But I mentioned Dr. Cambone. He was all Florida A&M all the time as well. But part of the reason, and I mentioned last class, that they had all these folks, these brilliant scientists, could only teach at these HBCUs, but they were getting their next generation ready. And he cataloged most of the first Black PhDs, like the first 50 Black PhDs, and where they went and what they did. All right, so the Association of Black Psychologists and APA, okay, versus the American Psychological Association. So, and I'm just kind of contrasting these two. With ABPSI, IQ testing needs to be reformed or done away with. With APA, they're saying IQ testing is helpful. Too bad if poverty makes your IQ low. Right? And that's the nice liberal version. Some would just say, well, you know, they're inferior, talking about Black folks who have low IQ scores. Okay. Right? ABPSI says, study what is right with Black people. Again, enliven and illuminate the soul. APA says study the problem of Black people, right? And compare them to others. In the early 90s, early 2000s, I was doing research studies in school districts on black students and about black students. And I had people say, well, you have to compare that to other people. And I said, no, I don't. and in particularly, these are the students who are struggling the most. So I've already done most of the comparison. That's why I narrowed it down to black students. Right? But there's still some of this mentality that you can't study black people by themselves because it does the rest of the world no good. Right? So underneath that, there's this assumption that we're not human enough to be on our own. Right?
Is this like, is this current? Like this is now?
This was kind of, but there's still some groups that are there, right? That I mentioned before, there's this Nobel Prize winning scientist, and he was stripped of his Nobel Prize for his racist ideas, but there's still ideas out there like that people believe, and I'm talking like Harvard trained scientists who believe in this kind of, this is the only way to do things. Anyone else have a comment? Jump in.
When talking about the IQ test, didn't they have to like amend their own test a couple times so they would score higher?
That's right. So in the state of California where I'm at, they made it illegal. Not illegal. Court cases were lost, and the Department of Education stated, and they put out a memo, said, do not test black students using IQ tests. For special ed placement, and they're very particular about special ed placement. You can do it for gifted and talented placement, but a lot of places were getting sued, so they just got rid of IQ testing altogether because they were getting sued and it was too contentious. Because once they lost one court case, so get this, a group of black families sued the state of California and said you can't do this and keep putting black students in special ed. It didn't stop it, but it slowed kind of the tide of it. Okay. And the biggest problem was that they were training people over a week or a weekend to give IQ tests, but they weren't training them like having a full PhD to go do it. It was just, people with a master's degree who were school counselors or reading teachers who just, we figure you can do it. And you can train a 19-year-old to give the test, but to interpret and score it, you have to know what you're doing. The other thing they did was like there was a 6-hour retarded child, right? They're retarded for 6 hours at school. They go home, they're able to make change, they're able to take care of their brother and sister, they're memorizing memory verses, they're up in the choir, they've learned all these songs. That's not retarded, right? But that was part of the issues that were going on. So the major split, AB Psych starts in 1968, right in the same county as the Black Panther Party starts, right? Same 2 years after the Black Panthers Party starts. And so the split, but these were like very clear distinctions between the two. Okay. ABCI, Statistical Measures of Black Success. That's what we're looking for. What's right with black people again? And then APA has continued to look to statistical measures of dysfunction. What's wrong with people? The world, right? You've heard of the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, okay? The world has said, we don't want that anymore because it's too subjective and it's based upon your stats of what's wrong with people. We'd rather look at what works best with the brain and look at that research and then realign this whole conversation about what a disorder is. And the rest of the world is looking to move to that. There's people who make a lot of money off of the DSM though. You had your hand up towards the back there.
Yeah, are you still on this slide?
Oh man, good call. Let me see if I can get that going. There we go. That's the one.
side doesn't use the diagnostic physics.
Some people do, some people don't. But they do it by looking at, okay, this is information. It's not the end-all be-all of what's happening with this particular child or adult or family. It's information and a tool that we can use, but it isn't the definitive and final word. It's to everything. And then also we want to look at everything. So when I would do my psych reports, I'd go and do the observation at home and provide a more well-rounded viewpoint of who that child is. Rather than doing another test, I do a longer interview with the family. Right. And I'm not against IQ testing. I've never been against it, but I am for the proper use. right, in the proper context. If I go to places and people haven't read the Journal of Black Psychology, but yet they swear, man, I serve black people. Okay, I'm worried about you. Yeah. Okay. So they had some particular demands, right? And so they wanted to integrate the workforce. I'm sorry, that one got kind of mangled. But they were looking to integrate the workforce with more African Americans with graduate school, address racist content in an APA journal and get rid of those. APA established programs that address the concerns of minorities, and then the Journal of Black Psychology and Black Studies. Okay. So, many influential black psychologists. Francis Cecil Sumner, I mentioned him last week. He was the first one with a PhD in psychology. Inez Beverly Prosser, the first and then second one, but also the first woman with a PhD in psychology. Mamie and Kelly Clark. William Cross, that's who I'm in the picture with right there. And he just retired this last year, right? That's how close we are to the development of black psychology. But he did the identity development that we talked about. Yeah, that I put on the board last time. And we'll talk about that a little bit more, but William Cross contributed a great deal to black psychology. Right. Reginald Jones, he's one who wrote a lot of books on IQ testing, measurement, but doing the right thing and figuring that out. He was in both APA and AB Psy. All right. There's many more, but all these folks are in your book. AfricanAmerican Spirituality, and I've been touching on it throughout, but I wanted to hit on a few themes before we go. We got until 2:15?
Yeah.
All right. So, spirituality is defined as a connection to a higher power, an internalization expression of key values, right? So if you go to a white worship service, my kids grew up going to mostly white schools. They would pray for, Congress when President Obama was the president. And then they went on a field trip to a Kojic church in LA, huge West Angeles Church of God in Christ. West Angeles is where Stevie Wonder stops by from time to time, that kind of thing. And they were always praying for the president. The kids had never even thought, why are you praying for President Obama? Because we don't want him killed. Right? They had never done that in their church, the white kids who came to visit this black church, right? But the black church is an expression of our experiences, right? Religion is a mechanism for achieving spirituality. Now, here's some things about, that the book was bringing out that black folk see, they're reading the Bible more often, they're attending religious services, they're praying more frequently compared to pretty much every other ethnic group in the United States. See the Bible as accurate. There were some other ones like the, devil's real, right? They believe in heaven, whereas other ethnic groups, everything was iffy, squishy. Okay, some more demographics. Women attend more services than men, and that's a whole another conversation. All right. Married are more likely to attend church. Older people pray more. African Americans pray more frequently than whites. Right. And I'm talking they'll take these surveys throughout the week. And these are huge research firms, like the Pew Research Group. They're looking at spirituality and other things. If you've watched over the last 10 years, we've seen a decline in church attendance and connection for most Americans, right? So, yeah. But black folk are still kind of holding on even amidst that decline in church attendance, right? And I would even say it's not so much about church for black folk as it is spirituality. And there's some other slides that will show that. Most black folk are most likely to have been raised in their denomination, So it's not like we're going to get converted to something else as likely, right? And so of that group, we were about like 59% were raised in that denomination. Okay, 22% of of Jehovah's Witnesses are black. 24% of American Muslims are black. 32%. They didn't have this in the book, but Africans or African Americans make up 32% of the SDA church.
In the world or in the nation?
In the world.
Only
Yeah.
32.
Only 32. Yeah. That's if we look at the whole world, but nonetheless, that's huge for any of these American-made denominations.
Yeah.
That's ridiculously large. Okay. Interesting thing, scholars estimate that 50 to 30% of stolen Africans, I'm talking about those from the Atlantic slave trade, were Muslim. Okay. So they were already, had a kosher diet, right? Had a prayer life. They already had a religious structure. So they weren't given something that they didn't already have. Just an aside, I get reminded of this every Christmas. Muslims celebrate Christmas. They like Jesus too. He's just not the Son of God, but they like Jesus too. All right, you can get into some of these other historical influences. If you take a look at the notes, I got some other pieces in there. There's plenty of issues with the African American church. And I'll say some of these last pieces here. Spirituality and coping with stress as a buffer against stress. Helps with taking care of sick family members. Let me see if I can move these forward. Yeah, there we go. Better coping among children who live in neighborhoods with violence. This is huge. Right? You're going to church and you live in a violent neighborhood, you're going to have better coping mechanisms. Right. Yeah.
Is all of this what we should know for the quiz, or should we look in the textbook to read more?
You can look at the textbook to read more, but I'm taking a quiz from this because not everybody has the textbook. But by next week, I'm expecting everybody to have this textbook. Right. So when we come back on Thursday, be ready for similar style quiz, but over this material.
Huh?
But are we still able to use the notes like we were able to use?
Yes. Open note, open brain.
That's what
Open brain. Don't get locked in. Open your mind.